Underneath the engine on the passenger side, there is a splash shield protecting the belt and pulleys. We're going to use our T27 Torx bit to go ahead and remove these two screws here. We're going to remove the shield. Now that we have that cover off, you can see the serpentine drive belt right here. It used to be the full width of the pulleys, and it has now shredded and is dry rotted. And the only way we can get this off is to cut it. This does not have an adjuster on here or a tensioner, so we're going to have to use a special tool to install the new belt. So let's go ahead and cut this belt now. You want to wear safety glasses. And then go ahead and remove the belt. And we'll throw this out. Now what we're going to do is we want to loosen these 4 bolts on the front of the water pump pulley. We tried to loosen them with the belt still on, but the belt was so worn and it only had about 2 to 3 ribs on the belt. It would not hold the pulley from spinning. So what we're going to do is we're going to use our 10mm wrench. We're going to use a pry tool. We're going to lock 2 of the bolts and loosen the bolts. We're just going to work our way around to loosen these bolts for now. All right, we have them all loose. Let's move up top. Now on your alternator, you have the upper pulley right here. On the bottom side, you're going to have a 15mm bolt that is going to come out towards the passenger side fender. So we're going to use a 15mm deep socket with our ratchet, loosen and remove that bolt. Go ahead, loosen and remove it. On the top of the alternator, we have 2 pieces of hardware right here holding the alternator to the bracket. There's a 15mm bolt here and a 15mm nut here. Let's go ahead and loosen these. This bolt here is using an E8 inverted Torx. Let's go ahead and remove this bolt next. The reason why we're removing this bolt is that the alternator doesn't come far enough forward without binding up on this stud. So we'll just remove the stud. Now we're going to go ahead and disconnect the ground terminal on our battery. So go ahead and use our 10mm socket. Loosen that up. I'm going to go ahead and spin that off. Set that aside. Now on the back side of the alternator, there's going to be a rubber boot here with the battery cable that's going to it. We're going to just use a pick. I'm going to pluck that rubber boot down and off of that. Grab that and set that aside. Using a 13mm socket, we're going to go ahead and loosen and remove the nut. There we go. Then we can go ahead and remove the cable off of the alternator. Set that aside. Right underneath that, there is an electrical connector. We're going to reach down and in, pinch the tab on that. It's a little tough to get to. Once that connector is off, we can go ahead and work the alternator up and out of the vehicle. Now we have our expansion tank plastic line right here. We're going to pinch these little tabs, slowly work that and pop that out. And we're just going to follow this along Pop this out of its retainer tabs and just set that aside. Now what we did was went ahead and we just grabbed an old oil bottle and we cut off the bottom. And we're just going to use this to catch some of our fluids that we're going to be taking out of our expansion tank right here. I want to go ahead and unscrew the cap. And you can use anything like a turkey baster or whatever you have. And we're going to suck out the fluid that's in here. I'm going to collect that in our container. And we're going to do this until the tank is pretty much low, because we have to disconnect the hose off the bottom of it. So this will prevent a lot of the coolant from running everywhere. What I do is I actually put some rags right here, or some towels, to go ahead and catch any residual coolant that's going to come out of the expansion tank here. We now want to disconnect this lower hose off the bottom, and to do so we have to loosen the hose clamp. I want to go ahead and do so. I'll loosen that clamp. Then we'll try and work this hose off. Coolant will come out, so you want to make sure that if you don't have these rags, or even with the rags, have a catch can underneath the vehicle to catch any residual fluid that might run out. Now once it hoses off, we should be able to go ahead and lift up the reservoir tank here. There are 2 tabs on each side of the tank that actually fit onto metal brackets. So we're going to go ahead and pull the tank up off of that. Go ahead and remove your tank and set that aside. Now these hoses still have coolant in there. I'm going to disconnect it from this little clip down on the side here and just pull this up out of the way. And I am just going to run a zip tie around this just to keep it up out of the way for now. Go ahead and remove our towel here, or the rags. So what we're going to do is use a floor jack. We're going to use a block of wood, set that on there. I'm going to roll this underneath, and we're going to apply some pressure on the engine oil pan. We're not going to jack up the vehicle. We're not going to jack up the engine. We're simply putting this there to support the engine. I'm going to go ahead and remove the 3 15mm bolts holding the motor mount to the chassis. Now we're going to remove these 2 nuts here and here. These are 18mm. Now these actually came out with the studs. We now go ahead and grab that motor mount. And this is why we used the jack to support the motor. Now we're going to go ahead and remove the 4 bolts holding the water pump pulley on. When we removed the motor mount, the engine came down a little bit, so we're just going to jack it up a little bit. Now let's go ahead and remove those bolts the rest of the way. go ahead and use our 10mm wrench here and just loosen that up a little bit more. Go ahead and remove our pulley. Now on the front side of the engine, we have our timing cover. This is a series of 8mm bolts going around the perimeter and through the middle, securing the cover on. Let's go ahead and remove those. Now with all the bolts removed, we're going to go ahead and try and loosen this front timing cover and remove that. We're just going to use a trim tool here, or a pry tool. Just try and work this loose. Go ahead and pull this up and out. We're going to use an 18mm socket and some extensions to go ahead and put these on the lower crankshaft bolt. And we're going to rotate the engine a little bit. And what we're going to do is line up the cam gears on the top of the engine. Now on your cam gears right here, we want to go ahead and mark these on the top of the cover. So when we have these lined up, we're going to take our marker. We have our dot right here. We'll go ahead, and we had already marked the front cover right here with our dot on the cam gear. We're going to do the same on the back. We have our little notch right here. I'm going to line that up on the back cover and mark that. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to use a wedge tool, and we're going to push it between the belt and the upper gear. Now this is a spring-loaded cam gear right here, so we want to go ahead and lock this in so it doesn't rotate. With that being wedged in there, that'll prevent this gear from spinning once we loosen that belt. So as an extra precautionary, we're going to go ahead and use some plastic clamps right here, and we're going to lock in this belt. We're going to do it on both sides of the belt. Now the belt tensioner has a tab on it with a hole in it right there. And what we want to do is we want to loosen up the center bolt just a little bit, and we want to go ahead and adjust that so that it lines up with this tab right here. And we're going to go ahead and put a drill bit in there. You can use any type of pin that will be pretty solid in there. Don't use a cotter pin, it might be too soft, it might bend, but this is going to lock that tensioner into position. That way we can go ahead and remove that belt. Now on the front of the tensioner is a 13mm bolt. This bolt goes through and into the water pump, so this has to be removed in order for us to get the water pump out. We're going to use a 13mm wrench. We're going to just loosen this bolt just a tiny bit. All right, with that loose, I'm going to go ahead and try and rotate that tensioner and lock that in place. So we're able to bring the pins together, and we put a drill bit in those two holes once they were lined up. Now we're going to go ahead and remove the cam tensioner bolt. Let's go ahead and remove this cam tensioner bolt. So now we have the tensioner. You can see we had lined up the two tabs with the drill bit in there. Once we reinstall this here into place, we go ahead and line up the belt, make sure the belt is where it needs to be, and then we'll pull the bit, and this tensioner will come back and apply the tension needed to the belt to hold it onto the cams. Now this is our replacement water pump. There's going to be a series of bolts. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 bolts. I'm going to remove those and remove the old water pump. Now there will be residual coolant behind the water pump, so have a catch can or some towels or something underneath. This is the last bolt, and you can see the coolant seeping out between the water pump and the block there. Let's go ahead and gently work that water pump loose. I'm going to use a pry tool just to gently pry the water pump out, let that coolant drain. Go ahead and work our water pump out. All right, so we already put our gasket on the back of the water pump with a couple dabs of RTV to hold that in place. I'm going to feed the water pump behind the belt. Work this on over and into place. And get this lined up. Start installing our bolts. We did also clean the surface of the engine itself, just to make sure there's no gasket debris. Ours was super, super clean. We're just going to try and get the bolts that I can reach by hand installed first. Some of these bolts you may need a mirror to go ahead and see where you're placing those, because a few of these bolts here have blind spots where you can't actually see the holes. Now that we have all of our bolts in, let's go ahead and we're going to just snug them all down. Let's go ahead and torque these bolts down to 89 inch-pounds. Once you get this one torqued, continue to the other 4. Now we have our cam belt running across. We lined up our back notch with the little red mark that we had here. Bring the belt around, and we're going to bring that tension in a little bit. Now we're going to take our tensioner right here, and we're ready to go ahead and install this. We have our drill bit in here, or your lock tool or pin or whatever you have in there. So you want to pay attention that this was pretty much around that 10 o'clock area when we removed it. We're going to go ahead and install this here. Start to get the tensioner bolt installed. Let's go ahead and do that. Now we're using a pick to go ahead and get behind the belt, just to try and pull that out and get our tensioner behind it. Get our thread started on our bolt. And thread that in as far as we can. And we're going to go ahead and get that bolt torqued down. Now you want to torque this bolt to 177 inch-pounds. It is recommended by the manufacturer that you replace this bolt with a brand new bolt. So now that we have the tensioner on and we have our belt and everything lined up, I'm just going to apply a little bit of pressure on the belt. I'm going to go ahead and remove the bit on the tensioner. Go ahead and remove our clamps on the belt. And then we'll go ahead and remove our wedge on the top. I'm going to go ahead and install our timing cover. Go ahead and lower this down into place. Once we get this positioned into place, we're going to go ahead and start getting our bolts installed. We're going to go ahead and start with our top center bolt right here. This is the longest out of all of the bolts. I'm going to go ahead and get that started by hand. Just catch it a few threads. Then we continue around. Get as many of these started by hand as we can. Once we get all of these started, we're going to go ahead and snug them down. The timing cover itself has metal sleeve inserts on here, so you don't crack the plastic cover by over tightening. So you can just go ahead and snug these down. Once the bolt bottoms out, just give it a little bit more. It's snug, just a little crank, and there you go. I'm going to continue this all the way around. I'm going to go ahead and install our water pump pulley. Get one bolt started here. I'm just going to go ahead and thread that down as far as I can by hand. Now that we have that one in, let's go ahead and install the other 3, and then we'll snug them down. And we're just using as a pry tool to lock onto the 2 bolts as we rotate this through.
That sounds good.
and snug up those bolts. All right, let's go ahead and lower our motor mount down into position. I'm going to get a few of these bolts started by hand. So we're just going to spin these in a few threads. We're not going to tighten this down yet. Now at this point here, we're going to go ahead and operate the jack. We want to go ahead and get these two bolt holes lined up with the engine itself. Once we get that lined up, we're going to get those two bolts started thread-wise itself. So let's go ahead and do so. Let's go ahead and lower this motor a little bit. Get that one started. Let's get the back one in. Let's go ahead and tighten down the 3 bolts for the base mount to the chassis, and then we'll tighten up the engine mounts. Our original mount has some wear and dirt on there, so I'm going to actually line up the original bolts with those marks on the mount. All right, this side one here is lined up. The upper center one is lined up. I'm going to snug those down, and then we'll tighten up the last one in the back. All right, let's tighten down our actual mount to engine bolts. Let's go ahead and lower down our reservoir. I'm going to line up the metal tabs. Line up the metal tabs with the mounts on the reservoir or expansion tank, whatever you want to call it. I'm going to go ahead and release our little zip tie that we put on there to hold this hose out of the way. Swing that around and get that lined up. I'm going to grab our pliers, open up our hose clamp. Let's go ahead and work that hose on. At this point here with the engine mount installed, we can go ahead and lower the jack and remove this from the vehicle. And on our alternator, we have our positive battery cable that needs to go onto this stud right here. And we also have a connector on the bottom side that we need to also get attached. So we're going to lower this down. Kind of work this around into position. I'm going to reach in. Press that connector in. And you'll hear an audible click once it locks in. Next, we're going to go ahead and grab our battery cable. I'll line that up on that stud. that nut started on there. Once we get that started, we're going to go ahead and snug that down. All right, so once I get snug, make it a little bit tighter, maybe another 1/4 of a turn on that. I'm going to install our rubber cap on the top of that bolt head right there. Press it into place. I'm going to go ahead and slide the long stud into the engine right here. Install the long bolt beside it. I want to go ahead and make sure that the stud is threaded in all the way. Once that's snugged in, we can now go ahead and install the nut on the front side of it here. With all 3 bolts started, let's go ahead and tighten them down. Once it bottoms out, another 1/4 of a turn. Let's go ahead and tighten up that bottom bolt. I'm going to do the same on this one. So once it's snug, another 1/4 turn, and it should be good. Let's now go ahead and take our expansion tank hose and line this up. And we're just going to gently push this on. And you'll hear the click securing it in place. The hose itself pops into retainers running along the fuel rail. There's one right here. And then there's one forward of it right here. With our old belt removed, let's take the new belt. I'm going to feed this down. And this is what they call a stretch to fit belt. I'm going to feed this around our alternator. These go down around our AC system. Let's go ahead and get underneath the vehicle and finish the installation. So let's go ahead and install our guide tool right here. I'm going to get our 18mm socket on the crankshaft. So once you get the belt lined up and put on, it's gonna take maybe 3 to 5 revolutions for the belt to walk its way all the way on, fit onto all of the ribs, on all of the pulleys. You have your crank, your AC or non-AC pulley, and then you have your alternator pulley up top. Make sure all the ribs are lined up. Let's install our belt cover here and take one of our screws. I'm gonna go ahead and get that started by hand. And grab the other screw and do the same for this one here. Once those are in, we're just going to go ahead and snug those down. Let's go ahead and install our ground terminal right here. We'll snug that down. Let's go ahead and use the appropriate coolant for the system. So we did go ahead and fill up our Degas bottle or overflow tank to the full line. We're going to go ahead and start the vehicle and let the system purge and take what it needs for coolant. We'll keep an eye on it and fill it as needed. And once we have the engine running and our coolant level is up to our max line, you want to go ahead and let it run for a little bit and let that give the engine time to warm up. Let that thermostat open up and take what it needs for coolant. Once that thermostat opens up, it could take a half hour, it could take 40 minutes. That should take more coolant, and then you can refill or fill to the max line as necessary. At this point here, we're all set. I'm going to go ahead and close the cap. Watch for any bubbles coming up through this here, for any other burping or purging. If you don't see any, you should be all set.